The air was chilly, a hint of winter in the breeze, as Margaret sat alone on the bench outside the shopping mall, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the leather handbag in her lap. The bright fluorescent lights of the entrance flickered, casting long shadows across the quiet parking lot. She glanced down at the watch on her wrist, a gift from her late husband, Charles, almost 30 years ago. She had been so proud of it when he gave it to her, a small token of the life they'd built together. But now, that life seemed as distant as the warmth she used to feel when their children ran through the house laughing. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Margaret had been excited when her daughter, Emily, called her earlier that morning. It had been so long since they'd all done something together, something fun, something special. Emily and her husband, Mark, had insisted on taking her out for the afternoon to celebrate her 75th birthday. A lunch at the new Italian bistro, followed by a trip to the mall for some shopping. Her heart had swelled at the thought of it. Family, laughter, memories. But now, she was sitting here alone. Emily and Mark had left her behind, at the mall. Just like that. It wasn't an accident. She knew it deep in her bones. She had watched them walk out the door of the bistro, talking among themselves, and then turn the corner toward the car. They hadn't even looked back. They hadn't asked if she was ready or if she wanted to finish her tea. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. She wasn't even worth a second thought. The pain of being abandoned was nothing compared to the sting of betrayal. For years, Margaret had given her all, her time, her money, her heart to her children. She'd helped pay for Emily's first apartment, loaned money when Mark's business hit hard times, even sacrificed her own health for their well-being. And this was how they repaid her? By leaving her on a cold bench, discarded like an old piece of furniture? Margaret blinked, fighting back the tears. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the pillar that held the family together. But today, she was beginning to see the truth for what it was. She was nothing more than an afterthought to them. Her thoughts began to swirl, the sting of abandonment turning to something more, a deep, seething anger. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. She had spent too many years being the quiet, obedient mother, swallowing the hurt in silence. But she wasn't that person anymore. She had spent her life working for a family that had taken. They had used her, drained her, and now they had left her to wither away in a world that had no place for her. No more. Without giving it a second thought, Margaret stood up and made her way toward the nearest payphone. She didn't need to call Emily or Mark. She had already seen enough. The time had come for the scales to tip. It was time for her to finally stop playing the role of the victim and take control of her fate. Margaret's hands shook as she dialed a number from memory. It was time to talk to a lawyer. The consequences of her family's actions would be severe. They didn't know it yet, but their betrayal would cost them in ways they couldn't even imagine. She wasn't about to let them walk all over her any longer. She had been the one who held everything together for so long, and now it was time for her to rebuild. From the ashes, a new Margaret would emerge, one who would stop at nothing to get the justice she deserved. "What goes around comes around," she whispered to herself as the phone rang. The voice on the other end greeted her, and she knew this was the start of something big, something that would change everything. As the phone call ended, Margaret walked back to her car, her steps firmer, more purposeful. Her pulse raced, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Something she hadn't felt in years. The thrill of reclaiming control. The taste of justice that was just within reach. And she was determined to savor it. Margaret had always been a good woman. A loving mother, a dedicated wife. She had never asked for much. A little respect, a little acknowledgement. But for years, her children had taken advantage of her kindness. She had ignored the warning signs, too willing to believe that everything would work itself out. After all, what kind of mother would she be if she didn't sacrifice everything for her children? But now she was seeing the truth through eyes that had finally opened. The money they drained from her, the way they manipulated her into thinking that her needs didn't matter, the years of care she had provided, both emotional and financial, that were now forgotten as if they had never existed. And the final straw, being left at the mall, that was the moment she knew things had to change. But it was also the moment she realized how much power she still had. The power of knowledge, the power of strategy, and the power of retribution. This wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about something deeper, something more profound. It was about dignity. It was about respect. It was about making sure that no one ever took advantage of her again. If you've ever felt betrayed by those you loved, if you've ever been made to feel small or invisible, then this story is for you. It's for those of us who have given everything and got nothing in return, who have spent years building up others only to be cast aside when we are no longer useful. This is a story of redemption, of justice, of a woman who will stop at nothing to make things right. But before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice, redemption, and sweet revenge. You won't want to miss what happens next. The journey had only just begun. As Margaret walked to her car, she knew that soon everything would change. The fight for her dignity was just getting started, and no one, not even her own children, would stop her from reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Margaret sat at the small dining table in her kitchen, her fingers tracing the worn edges of a photograph. The picture was old, faded, but the faces were as clear in her memory as if the moment had just happened. It was of her and Charles, taken on their honeymoon in the rolling hills of Tuscany. They were both young, smiling, full of hopes and dreams for a future they would build together. Charles with his laugh that always made her heart skip a beat, and her, always the practical one, ready to keep them grounded, to keep them moving forward no matter what life threw at them. They had made promises that day, promises to love each other through thick and thin, promises to always look out for one another, to care for each other as they grew old. Charles had said he would always make sure she was taken care of, that he would never leave her wanting. And he had kept that promise until the day he passed away, leaving Margaret to carry on without him. Their shared dreams had always been simple, rooted in the desire to build a family and to create a home filled with love. They had talked for hours about what they wanted for their children, their hopes that they would grow up strong, independent, and kind. Charles had always been the one to encourage their children to chase their dreams, to push through hardships, while Margaret supported them with her steady, quiet strength. It wasn't until Charles's sudden death that the cracks in the family dynamic began to show. Margaret had always believed that family was everything, and for years she had poured her heart and soul into making sure their children felt loved, supported, and valued. But when it came time to lean on them, to seek help, they turned away. The sacrifices she had made for her children were too many to count. There was Emily's first apartment, for instance. Emily had called Margaret in tears, saying she couldn't afford the rent. Margaret hadn't hesitated. She cashed in part of Charles's life insurance policy and sent her daughter a check for $5,000, telling her to use it as she needed. A few months later, it was Mark, Emily's husband, who asked for a loan to cover some unexpected medical bills after a procedure went wrong. Margaret didn't even ask questions. She just signed the check for $7,000 and told him to take care of himself. And then there were the children's college funds. Margaret had worked overtime for years to put money aside for their education. Both of her children had graduated debt-free, their tuition fully covered by her hard work and sacrifices. When Emily decided to go back to school for a master's degree, Margaret didn't even hesitate to loan her another $10,000, despite her own growing financial difficulties. Emily had promised to pay it back when she could, but Margaret knew that wasn't likely to happen anytime soon. Each time, Margaret was left feeling a pang of pride mixed with an underlying worry. She had given so much, but her children never seemed to notice. They took it all in stride, never once acknowledging the toll it was taking on her or the sacrifices she had made. She had hoped it would all be worth it, that one day, when she was older, they would be there for her, that when the time came, they would show her the same love and devotion she had shown them. But as the years wore on, Margaret found herself becoming more isolated. Her children, now grown and living their own lives, had fewer and fewer moments to spend with her. Holidays were often rushed affairs with family members rushing in and out. The holidays passed, and Margaret found herself more alone than ever. No phone calls, no visits. Her children were busy with their own lives, as always. She was left with a mounting sense of isolation and an aching awareness of how much she had given and how little she had received in return. As the years passed, the financial burden of supporting her children became heavier. Margaret could no longer afford to give them the same level of help she once had. The savings she'd worked so hard to accumulate were now nearly gone. Yet her children never seemed to notice. They never asked how she was doing. They never checked in to see if she needed anything. Margaret clung to the old values she had been raised with, the belief that family was everything, that love and loyalty were sacred bonds. But she began to see how those values were being violated. The respect she had shown her children for so many years was no longer being reciprocated. They had taken what they wanted and left her behind. They had forgotten the woman who had given them everything. And that was when Margaret began to realize the truth. Her sacrifices had been taken for granted. Her love had been exploited. The family she had poured everything into had turned their backs on her. The very values she had upheld for so long, sacrifice, loyalty, love, had been shattered. And now, as she sat alone in her kitchen, the realization dawned on her. She had given everything, and they had taken it all. But not anymore. The time had come for Margaret to take back what was rightfully hers. It had started like any other family gathering, a simple Sunday afternoon dinner at Emily's house. Margaret had prepared the same meal she had made for years: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and a green salad. The scent of home-cooked food filled the air as she stepped inside. The warmth of the house provided a small comfort against the growing unease that had been festering in her chest for months. Emily had greeted her with a tight smile and a quick hug, but the warmth wasn't there. It never was anymore. Mark was sprawled out on the couch, his eyes glued to the TV, barely acknowledging her presence. Their children, now in their late teens and early 20s, barely looked up from their phones as she set the meal on the table. Margaret had told herself that maybe she was imagining things. Maybe the distance, the lack of warmth was just a phase. After all, they were all busy. Life was hectic. Her children had their own lives, their own responsibilities. But the knot in her stomach tightened every time she entered their home, every time they treated her like a guest rather than the mother who had sacrificed everything for them. As the meal progressed, Emily brought up the topic of finances in a casual, almost too nonchalant way. "Mom, we've been talking about the house lately, and, Mark's business is struggling. We've been thinking—" She trailed off, as if unsure whether she should continue. Margaret felt a cold wave of anxiety wash over her. She knew where this was headed. "You're going to need help," Margaret said, her voice a little shaky, but she couldn't stop herself. She had always been there when they needed her. She had always stepped in, whether it was to cover medical bills or to help with rent. "How much is it this time?" Emily exchanged a quick glance at Mark, a glance that was almost too quick, too practiced to be innocent. "Well, we were thinking," Emily hesitated, "maybe we could take another loan from you, Mom, just until things get back on track." Margaret's heart sunk, but she didn't respond immediately. She stared at her daughter, trying to process the words. Another loan? The house she had once bought for them had already cost her more than she could afford. The money she had poured into Mark's failed business had put her on the brink of financial ruin. They had promised to pay it all back, but the repayments never came, the excuses never stopped, yet here they were again, asking for more. "I've helped you both so many times," Margaret said, her voice trembling but firm. "But I can't keep doing this. I'm not made of money." Emily's face tightened, her lips curling into a smirk that sent a chill down Margaret's spine. "Mom, you know how hard things have been for us. We said you wanted to see us succeed. This is just a temporary thing. You won't even miss it." Mark added, barely looking up from the TV. "It's just a small loan, Mom. You've got plenty of savings, right? Don't be so tight with your money." The words hit Margaret like a slap. Tight with her money? She had spent her entire life scraping by to help her children, to make sure they had everything they needed. And now they were accusing her of being stingy, of holding back on them? Something inside Margaret snapped. She had spent years enabling their toxic behavior, giving them everything they asked for, sacrificing her own well-being for theirs. But this was the final straw. Her voice rose, sharp with anger. "Do you think I don't know what's going on? Do you think I don't see how you've taken advantage of me for years? I've given you everything I had, and you treat me like I'm nothing?" The room fell into heavy silence. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as her children stared at her, stunned by the sudden outburst. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the disbelief on their faces as if they couldn't comprehend why she was so upset. She could almost hear the thoughts running through their minds. How dare she challenge them after all they had done for her? Emily's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. "Mom, we're just asking for a little help. Why are you making this such a big deal? It's not like we're asking for a handout." "A little help?" Margaret's voice trembled with hurt. "I've been helping you both for years. I've sacrificed my own needs, my own comfort, so you could have everything you wanted. But I never asked for anything in return, did I? I never expected you to actually care about me. But you don't get to manipulate me anymore. Not this time." Mark's eyes finally left the TV, locking onto her with the look that sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. "Don't talk to us like that, Mom. We've done everything for you. We've been patient, we've been understanding, and now you're turning this into something else." "No," Margaret said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "You've done nothing for me. You've taken, you've drained, and you've used me. And for what? So you can have a bigger house, a newer car, a better life, while I'm left here alone, ignored? You've used me." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of truth. Margaret could see the shock in their eyes, the faint flicker of guilt that flashed across Emily's face before she quickly masked it with anger. But it was too late. Margaret had finally seen through their facade. They didn't love her, not like she had loved them. Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had cried too many times in silence. She was done being the victim. "I've given you everything," Margaret continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "And now I'm left with nothing. You've taken it all, but not anymore. I'm done. Don't ever ask me for another penny, another favor, or another moment of my time. This ends today." Emily and Mark stood frozen, speechless, their faces drained of color. For a moment, Margaret thought they might finally understand the pain, the betrayal, the endless exploitation. But as she turned and walked toward the door, she heard Emily's voice, sharp and dismissive. "You're just being dramatic, Mom." Margaret paused, her hand on the doorknob. Dramatic? The word echoed in her mind, and with it came a realization. She wasn't being dramatic. She wasn't overreacting. She was standing up for herself. For the first time in years. She turned to face them one last time. "No, Emily, I'm not being dramatic. I'm being strong." With that, she walked out the door leaving behind a family that no longer deserved her. The devastation that washed over Margaret wasn't from the confrontation itself, but from the realization that she had been exploited for so long. She had trusted her children, loved them with all her heart, and in return, they had drained her, taken advantage of her, and left her with nothing. But something inside her shifted that day. The anger was no longer a burden, it was fuel. Margaret wasn't going to let them get away with this, not anymore. She was going to take back her life. Margaret's hands trembled as she pulled open the file drawer in her study, the creaky old wood groaning in protest. The room, dimly lit by a single lamp, felt too quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She had avoided this moment for years, kept it buried in the recesses of her mind, but now it was time to face the truth head on. The truth about how deeply her family had exploited her. One by one, she began sifting through the various papers. There were bank statements, checks, loan documents, and bills that had been piling up for years. Each document felt heavier than the last. She could already see the pattern, but she needed to lay it out clearly. She needed to know just how much she had given and just how little she had received in return. She pulled out a few of the earliest bank statements first. The dates and amounts blurred in her mind, but she could no longer ignore the facts in front of her. She had given over $20,000 to Emily and Mark just in the last 5 years. Rent payments when they couldn't make ends meet, medical bills when Mark's business failed again, loans with no intention of repayment. The numbers blurred together, each one a reminder of the sacrifices she had made. Sacrifices they never acknowledged, never thanked her for. She flipped through more documents, some more recent. A loan for $7,500 to cover Emily's second car because she needed a safer car for the kids. Another $10,000 when Mark's business took a downturn again, this time for restructuring. Margaret had never asked for repayment. She had trusted them. She had believed that they would eventually get back on their feet and come to appreciate her sacrifices. But now, looking at these papers, Margaret saw only one thing: a clear pattern of financial abuse. They had taken everything from her: her money, her time, her energy, while offering nothing in return. Each loan, each check, each favor had been an investment into a relationship that had never been reciprocal. A shiver ran down her spine as she placed the documents back into the drawer. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal, but now she also felt something else: clarity. She had spent so long feeling like a victim, but now she could see the pattern. She wasn't just being taken advantage of in isolated incidents. This had been a continuous, deliberate exploitation of her resources. It had been going on for years, and they had never planned to stop. But she wouldn't let them get away with it any longer. Margaret sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. She needed more than just financial proof. She needed a strategy. Quietly, she began researching. She started with legal options, looking into how she could protect herself from further financial loss. She wasn't a lawyer, but she knew the basics. She needed to figure out her rights and what options she had to stop the ongoing drain on her finances. After an hour of searching, she found a local attorney who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation cases. She jotted down the number, the name of the firm, and a few notes about the process. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was real now. She wasn't just sitting back anymore. She was taking action. The next few days were filled with quiet planning. Margaret spent hours combing through legal forms, reading articles, and making phone calls. She felt the weight of the task ahead of her, but it wasn't a weight of fear anymore. It was the weight of determination. She had been wronged, and she was going to make sure they paid for it. As she gathered more evidence, she started to create a timeline in her mind, a clear picture of how her family had drained her finances, piece by piece. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about dignity. They had treated her like she was disposable, but she wasn't. She would show them that. Late one night, after a long day of gathering her records and researching legal strategies, Margaret found herself staring at a list of options on her screen. Some were legal avenues for financial recovery. Others were actions that might lead to an outright confrontation with her family. But there was something else she needed. A final piece to the puzzle. She needed to confront her children with undeniable proof that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, proof that their actions weren't isolated. They were part of a deliberate pattern of manipulation and theft. Margaret's hands were steady now, no longer shaking with the fear that had once paralyzed her. She printed out a detailed financial record of all the money she had given them over the years, along with the dates and amounts. It was more than just numbers on a page. It was evidence of the life she had given up for them. Next, she began drafting a letter. She would need to be careful. She would need to be precise. She had already made up her mind that this wasn't just about asking for repayment. It was about demanding acknowledgement, about forcing them to reckon with the damage they had done. As she wrote, the words flowed more easily than she expected. She was no longer afraid of them. She no longer feared their judgment. The letter outlined her financial contributions, her expectations for repayment, and a demand for an apology. But it also made it clear that this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about holding them accountable for the way they had treated her. When she finished, she printed the letter and stared at it for a moment. This was it. The weight of it sunk in. She wasn't just taking her life back. She was taking back her dignity. She wasn't going to allow her children to manipulate her any longer. And yet, there was still that nagging voice in the back of her mind. What if they refused? What if they just ignored her, or worse, tried to gaslight her into thinking she was imagining things? The emotional toll had been so great, and the fear of further rejection lingered. But she pushed those thoughts aside. She had a plan now, a clear path to follow, and there was no turning back. They were going to have to face the consequences. The day Margaret planned to send the letter, she felt a surge of excitement mixed with nerves. She had finally taken control. She had reclaimed her power. The day Margaret decided to execute her first counterstrike, the weight of her decision hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The letter was sealed and ready to send, but she knew that simply sending a letter wouldn't be enough. She needed to act. She needed to stop enabling them once and for all. It began with the bank account, the account she had shared with Emily for years, used for transferring money, paying bills, and generally helping the family when they needed it. Margaret had always been the one to keep things running smoothly, even when it came at the cost of her own financial security. But not anymore. With a steady hand, Margaret logged into her account and transferred the final sum of money, $15,000, back into her own savings account. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the figures on the screen. For years, this money had been a lifeline for Emily and Mark, a cushion they had relied on without ever thinking about how much it was draining from her. She hesitated for a split second, the weight of what she was about to do pressing on her chest, but then she clicked, confirm. The money was hers again. The second step was to cancel the automatic payments she had set up for their bills. Emily's mortgage, Mark's car loan. Even the small contributions she'd been making to help with the grandchildren's private schooling, gone. Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just about money. It was about control. She wasn't just a source of funds. She was a mother, a person worthy of respect, not a cash machine. It felt liberating, but also strangely terrifying. What if they fought back? What if they came for her, tried to guilt her into compliance? She had spent years being manipulated by them. What was going to stop them from doing it again? Her phone buzzed before she had time to dwell on the fear. It was Emily. "Mom, I just saw that the payments for the house and Mark's car have stopped. What's going on? We need to talk." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart beating faster. She had imagined this moment, but now that it was here, it didn't feel as triumphant as she thought it would. The guilt clawed at her. Was she doing the right thing? Was she betraying them? Or was she simply reclaiming her own life? She typed a short reply. "I'm no longer able to help you. You need to figure things out on your own." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came almost immediately. "What? Are you serious? After everything we've done for you? This isn't right. We've been struggling. Please don't do this." Margaret didn't respond right away. She stared at the screen, the words swimming in front of her eyes. They were trying to manipulate her again, trying to make her feel guilty, as if her years of sacrifices didn't mean anything, as if they had the right to take her hard-earned money and ignore her needs. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Mark. She let it ring. Margaret stood up, walking to the window, her fingers gripping the curtain. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the trees in her yard. For a moment, she let herself enjoy the peace, the silence of the house, now that the weight of her decision had been made. The world was still turning, despite the storm she had just created within her family. But then the phone rang again. It was Emily again. With a sigh, Margaret picked up the call. "What do you want, Emily?" Her voice was steady, though she could feel the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "Mom, I don't understand. You've always been there for us. Why are you doing this now? We need you." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. She had always been there for them, always ready to jump in and solve their problems, even when it meant sacrificing her own well-being. But no more. "I'm sorry, Emily," Margaret said, her voice firm but not without sadness. "I can't do this anymore. I've given you everything I have, and I've been left with nothing. You and Mark have used me, and I'm done." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice low, almost hurt. "I can't believe this. You're turning your back on us? You've never been this selfish." Margaret's breath caught in her throat, but she held firm. "No, Emily, I've been too selfless. You and Mark have taken advantage of my love and my generosity for far too long. I'm done." With that, she hung up. The emotional toll of the conversation weighed heavily on her, but as she put the phone down, she couldn't help but feel a small glimmer of satisfaction. She had finally taken control. The fallout came quickly. The next few days were filled with angry texts, phone calls, and even a few passive-aggressive messages left on her voicemail. Mark tried to guilt her into reconsidering, but each time he called, Margaret simply hung up. Emily sent long, tear-filled messages, asking her to reconsider, promising that she would pay her back. But it was all empty words. Margaret watched it all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and regret. The satisfaction came from knowing that she had finally taken a stand, from knowing that she had reclaimed her power. But the regret? That was harder to shake. She had been the one who had built this family up with her love and sacrifices. She had always tried to do what was best for them, and now it felt like they were rejecting her. They were angry, hurt, and confused, emotionally invested in a system that had always worked for them, but never for her. She couldn't help but wonder, was this really the right thing to do? But deep down, she knew it was. The first hint that Margaret's life was about to spiral into full-blown chaos came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping her tea, when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone, so when she opened the door, she was surprised to find Judy, her neighbor, standing there with a look of concern etched into her face. "Margaret, I need to talk to you," Judy said, her voice low and urgent. "I don't know if you've heard, but Emily and Mark are telling everyone that you've cut them off, completely. They're saying you're being cruel, that you're punishing them for no reason." Margaret's heart sank. She hadn't expected them to come at her like this, not so openly. She had anticipated some backlash, but this was different. This was public. Her own daughter and son-in-law were painting her as a villain to the very community that had once seen her as a strong, loving matriarch. Judy hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. "They're even saying you're trying to ruin their lives. It's getting around to everyone. And some of the others are starting to believe it. You need to know that people are talking." Margaret closed her eyes, the weight of the realization settling on her like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about money anymore. They were trying to destroy her reputation. Emily and Mark had turned her own community against her, spreading lies and painting her as the villain in a story she hadn't written. The betrayal felt deeper than ever. This wasn't just exploitation. This was an outright attempt to obliterate her life, to ruin her standing in the eyes of those who once held her in esteem. The next few days brought a wave of whispers, subtle at first, but gradually intensifying. Phone calls, quiet conversations at the grocery store, and murmured discussions at the coffee shop. It seemed like everyone Margaret had ever known had heard the story. Judy wasn't the only one who came to her with worried looks and hushed voices. People who had once called her a friend began to treat her with barely concealed judgment. The fabric of her social life was unraveling. Margaret had always been an active member of the local church, a regular at neighborhood events, a dependable friend who had helped anyone in need. But now she was the subject of gossip. People who had once greeted her with warmth began avoiding her gaze, crossing the street to avoid a conversation. Some of her former friends whispered behind her back when she walked into the local cafe. A few even turned their backs on her in the aisles of the market. They didn't know the full story, but they didn't need to. Emily and Mark had already made sure of that. The isolation stung. Margaret had spent years nurturing these relationships, being there for her neighbors and friends during tough times. But now, she was left alone. Her entire support system crumbling under the weight of her family's lies. What hurt more than the isolation, however, was the knowing. Knowing that the people she had trusted, who once admired her strength, were now doubting her. They were questioning her motives without hearing her side. Her children had turned the community against her, and there was nothing she could do about it. She wasn't sure who started it or how it spread so quickly, but the narrative had taken hold. Emily and Mark had painted a picture of a selfish, cruel mother who had suddenly cut off all support, leaving them to flounder and fail. They had told anyone who would listen that Margaret was hoarding her money, that she was punishing them out of spite, that she had no compassion or understanding. The idea that Margaret had once been the one to give them everything, her money, her love, her time, was erased. In its place was a story that painted her as a cold, callous woman. Then came the social media attacks. Margaret didn't use social media much, she was a private person, but Emily and Mark did, and they were quick to capitalize on it. They posted passive-aggressive statuses that made it clear Margaret was the villain. Emily shared personal stories, veiled in cryptic language about how some people have forgotten what family meant, how some people could be cruel in the name of money. The posts were subtle, carefully crafted to stir up the right amount of pity. They didn't directly attack Margaret, but the implication was clear. The community was getting the message loud and clear. Margaret had become the scapegoat, the one to blame for their failures. They didn't just want her money. Now they wanted to tarnish her reputation completely, to make sure that even if she didn't give them anything else, she would be nothing in their eyes. Margaret's phone buzzed again. Another message from Judy. "Margaret, I'm sorry, but it's all over Facebook. People are saying that you're being a greedy, bitter woman and that you don't deserve the help you've been given. They say you don't have the right to live comfortably while your own children are struggling. It's awful. You need to do something." Margaret could feel the blood drain from her face. Her children were manipulating everything, using the very platform she'd never bothered with to destroy her. The isolation Margaret felt was crushing, but something inside her hardened. As the days went on and the community continued to turn its back on her, her anger began to burn brighter, fiercer. How dare they? They had given her everything, her money, her time, her love, and now they were turning the world against her? They were making her look like the villain in a story where they were the ones who had taken from her. It was unjust, unfair, and deeply painful. But it was the final straw. They were trying to break her, but Margaret wasn't going to let them. The lies would only take her so far. She knew the truth, and eventually others would too. She wasn't going to sit back and let them tear her down any longer. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about justice, about ensuring that her children understood the true cost of their actions. The community had been manipulated, but Margaret knew that truth would always come to light. Her determination was solidifying into something concrete, something undeniable. She would stand up for herself, and she would make sure the world knew exactly what had happened. The next step was clear. She would confront her children with the truth. They couldn't hide forever. The moment had arrived. Margaret stood in front of the community center, the building where her life had once been filled with joy and camaraderie, now looming over her like a judge ready to pass sentence. Tonight, the truth would be exposed. Everything she had quietly suffered for years would finally come to light. The meeting had been scheduled hastily, at Emily's insistence, but Margaret knew exactly what was happening. Emily had called for this meeting under the guise of a family discussion to clear the air, but Margaret knew better. This was a calculated attempt to publicly shame her again, to use the community as a weapon against her. She wasn't going to let that happen. Inside, the community center was bustling. There were familiar faces, people who had once known her well, now standing in hushed circles, whispering to one another. I could hear snippets of conversation as I walked in, remarks about her sudden disappearance from social events, about the rumors that had been spread. "Did you hear? Margaret cut off Emily and Mark, and now she's holding all her money back." "I don't know. They say she's being unreasonable. She used to be such a strong woman, but now, I don't know." Margaret's stomach twisted with the familiar sting of isolation, but she stilled herself. She was about to change the narrative. She spotted Emily and Mark at the front of the room, sitting together, looking confident, as if they were the wronged parties. Emily flashed a tight smile when she saw Margaret, but there was no warmth behind it. Mark didn't even acknowledge her presence, his eyes fixed on the floor. The audacity of it all. These were the same people who had manipulated her for years, and now they had the nerve to paint her as the villain in front of the very community she had worked so hard to nurture.
Margaret approached the front of the room, where the chairs had been arranged in a circle. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of their judgment hanging in the air. She took a deep breath, the scent of coffee and stale air mixing in her senses. As she moved to the front, she was joined by her attorney, a quiet but sharp woman named Rachel, who had helped her gather the evidence for this moment. Rachel handed Margaret a folder, the folder that held everything. "Are you sure you're ready?" Rachel whispered, her voice a quiet reassurance. Margaret nodded. Her heart raced, but this was the moment she had been building toward for months. There was no turning back now. She stood at the front of the room, her back straight, the folder heavy in her hands. The murmur of the room gradually quieted as people turned their attention toward her. She could feel Emily's eyes on her, calculating, preparing for whatever Margaret was about to do. "Thank you for gathering here tonight," Margaret began, her voice steady, though it felt as if her words were pushing through layers of tension. "I know there have been a lot of things said about me recently, and I'm here to set the record straight. This isn't just about money. This is about the truth. The real truth." She opened the folder and pulled out the first set of documents, the bank statements. She glanced over at Emily and Mark, whose expressions had shifted from smug confidence to discomfort. The first page she revealed was a detailed record of the $20,000 she had given them over the years: loans, medical bills, personal expenses. She set the paper on the table in front of her, and the room went silent. "These," Margaret said, her voice calm but piercing, "are just a small portion of the money I have given my children. Over the years, I've supported them, loaned them money, and covered bills when they couldn't. I've done this because I love them. But what you need to understand is that none of this was ever repaid." She pulled out another document, a check for $7,500. "This is a loan I gave Emily when she wanted a new car. It was supposed to be paid back in installments, but it never was. There are dozens of checks and transfers like this, but none of them have been repaid." As she spoke, she could feel the room's gaze turning from her to her children. Some were whispering to each other, others watching intently, but no one was looking at Emily and Mark with the same admiration they once had. Margaret continued, "Over the years, I've been manipulated into giving. They've drained me emotionally, financially, and I've stood by believing they would appreciate it, believing they would see the sacrifices I made." Margaret's voice grew colder as she pulled out the next set of papers. Emails. They were exchanges between Emily and Mark where they spoke openly about their plans to take more from her, laughing about how easy it was to get her to give. One email from Emily read, "Mom's not going to stop helping us. We just need to keep making her feel needed." Another from Mark said, "Don't worry, she'll come through again. She always does." The room grew even quieter. The lies had been exposed. Emily's face was pale now, her mouth pressed tight in anger. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting around, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Margaret's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering. "This isn't just about the money. This is about respect. I've been a mother, a friend, a giver for so long that I forgot I deserved to be treated with the same respect and love I gave. Instead, I was treated like an ATM." She turned to face her children, her gaze fixed on them. "You used me, and now I'm done. The community deserves to know who you really are." As Margaret's words sank in, the room erupted. People began speaking out, some with quiet words of support, others with anger. They were shocked, not just by the revelations, but by the realization that they had been complicit in letting the lies and manipulation slide by for so long. One woman, a longtime friend of Emily, stood up. "I had no idea. I always thought you were the perfect family. Emily, Mark, how could you do this to your own mother?" Rachel, who had remained silent up until now, spoke up. "This is the truth. This is what Margaret has lived with for years, and now we're asking for an apology, a genuine apology for the emotional and financial abuse." Emily stood up abruptly, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and panic. "This isn't fair. You're twisting everything. We never meant for it to go this far. You're destroying us, Mom." But the damage was done. The lies had been exposed. The manipulation had been laid bare for all to see. Margaret felt a sense of vindication wash over her, an overwhelming sense of justice. For so long, she had been the one hurt, the one drained, the one discarded. But now, it was the family who would face the consequences of their actions. The tension in the room hung thick, but Margaret could finally breathe. The truth had come to light.
She didn't need to explain herself any further. The community had seen it. They heard the words, seen the proof, and they knew what kind of people Emily and Mark were. As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of support and sympathy came Margaret's way. A few people approached her, offering kind words. But Margaret didn't feel like celebrating. There was still a long road ahead of her. She had lost much in this process, but she had gained something far more important: respect and integrity. The aftermath of Margaret's confrontation was swift and unforgiving. The moment she had stepped into that room to expose the truth, everything began to change. In the hours that followed the meeting, Emily and Mark's carefully constructed image as the innocent victims was shattered. The whispers that had once been about Margaret, about her supposed cruelty and selfishness, were now focused on her children. The community that had once embraced them with open arms now saw them for what they were: manipulators who had taken advantage of a mother's love and kindness. Public humiliation followed quickly. Emily, once the picture of a loving daughter, found herself isolated from her social circle. Friends she had known for years now avoided her. Invitations to dinner parties, to family gatherings, to social events all stopped. People who had once praised her for being a hardworking mother now whispered behind her back, and when she entered a room, the conversation would fall silent. Mark, who had once been respected for his business acumen, watched as his professional connections began to pull away. Potential clients that he had worked with for years started distancing themselves as the truth of his financial manipulations was now well known. His reputation, like Emily's, was in tatters. His contacts refused to take his calls, his name became synonymous with deceit, and soon even his few remaining allies began to question him. For the first time in years, Margaret's phone rang with messages that weren't filled with guilt or manipulation. They were messages of support. Calls from old friends, neighbors, even distant relatives began pouring in. People she hadn't heard from in years reached out to express their support and admiration for her bravery. They apologized for not seeing the truth sooner, for not understanding what she had been going through. One of the most moving calls came from Judy, her longtime neighbor. "Margaret, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve any of this. I should have known. You've always been there for us, and we failed you. But you're not alone anymore. We've got your back. Whatever you need, we're here." For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a warmth in her chest, a warmth that had been missing for too long. The community was rallying to her side. People who had once turned their backs on her were now standing up for her, speaking out against the injustice that had been done. It was as if the weight of years of silent suffering had been lifted, replaced by a newfound respect and solidarity. The financial consequences for Emily and Mark were swift and brutal. Without the support of Margaret's constant financial assistance, they found themselves drowning in debt. Emily's mortgage payment, once covered by Margaret, was now overdue, and the bank was preparing to take legal action. Mark's business, already on the edge of collapse, quickly spiraled into bankruptcy as clients pulled out and suppliers stopped delivering goods. The life they had built on the back of Margaret's sacrifices was crumbling piece by piece, and there was no one left to help them. Emily's car, the one that Margaret had paid for, was repossessed when the loan payment stopped. Mark's business credit was ruined, and his attempts to salvage his reputation were met with rejection. Every penny that Margaret had once handed over so generously now seemed to come back to haunt them as they faced the consequences of their exploitation. The hard truth was clear. They had built their lives on lies, and now they would pay for it. As for Margaret, she didn't feel triumphant, not in the way she had imagined. The vindication she had longed for didn't come with a sense of victory, but with a quiet sense of relief. She had done what she had to do, and while part of her relished the moment of justice, the emotional toll of the confrontation still lingered. Margaret sat alone in her living room later that evening, looking out the window at the quiet street. The weight of the past few months seemed to settle over her, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that had built up for so long. The emotional toll had been immense. The betrayal, the isolation, the manipulation, it had all taken a toll on her heart and mind. But now as she sat in the silence, she could begin to process what had happened. She had reclaimed her life. She had finally taken a stand for herself. something she had been too afraid to do for years. But the price had been high. She missed the family she once knew. She missed the love she thought she had with her children. The feeling of being cast aside, rejected, and blamed for their failures still stung. It was hard to let go hope that things could have turned out differently. Yet, in the midst of this quiet reflection, Margaret began to feel something new. A sense of healing. Slowly the pain began to recede, replaced by a deeper understanding of her own strength. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had found a strength she didn't know she had. The woman who had once been a doormat, endlessly giving to others, had now learned how to reclaim her power. Despite the emotional toll, Margaret could see the changes beginning to take shape. As she looked at the messages of support and the community's newfound respect for her, she realized that she was not as alone as she had once feared. The people who mattered, her true friends, her community, had finally seen the truth. And then the messages from her family began. First, it was Emily. She texted Margaret a brief but tearful message. "I'm sorry. Please, let's talk. I didn't mean for things to go this way." Then Mark sent an email stating that he regretted everything that had happened and that he hoped they could, quote, "move past this," unquote. Margaret read the messages, but they no longer held power over her. They came from a place of manipulation, of trying to rewrite history, of attempting to regain the control they had lost. She didn't need their apologies. She didn't need them to come back. She had already forgiven herself for the mistakes she had made in enabling their behavior. She was ready to move forward. But this time, it was on her terms. The weeks following Margaret's public confrontation with Emily and Mark were filled with a quiet sense of justice. But that justice wasn't without a price. Margaret had taken back her life, but she couldn't help but feel the ripple effects of the choices she had made. Choices that had led to her children's downfall. Emily and Mark had always believed that they could rely on Margaret indefinitely, that they could drain her resources and continue their lives without consequences. But the world had changed for them quickly. Without her financial support, they were left to face the harsh reality of their poor decisions and irresponsible actions. What had once been a comfortable life was now slipping through their fingers. Financial ruin. Emily, once the proud owner of a modest home, found herself unable to make her mortgage payments after Margaret stopped helping. Her bank began sending notices of foreclosure, and soon enough, her home was repossessed. Her dreams of living in a cozy suburban house, hosting gatherings for her children, were crushed. Mark, who had once been a successful small business owner, watched as his business filed for bankruptcy. The clients who had once trusted him saw his name tarnished, and his attempts to restart his career were met with closed doors. His credit score plummeted, and loans that had seemed easily attainable before now felt like an impossible dream. The community he had once been an influential part of now saw him as a fraud, someone who had exploited the generosity of his mother-in-law to fuel his own failed ventures. Emily and Mark's financial spiral was relentless. They had always lived beyond their means, relying on Margaret's constant support to keep their lives afloat. With her no longer in the picture, their attempts to maintain their lifestyle were futile. Emily had to move into a small apartment, one she could barely afford, and Mark reluctantly took a job doing menial work, something that felt beneath him but was all he could get. They had lost everything they had once taken for granted: their status, their homes, their financial security. The cost of their exploitation was now inescapable. Margaret could hear the occasional murmurs about her children's downfall. Friends who had once whispered in support of Emily and Mark now spoke about the pair's fall of grace. The truth was out, and the community wasn't forgiving. As the months passed and the weight of their financial devastation set in, Emily and Mark began to feel the full brunt of their actions. The calls started to come, one after another. They had been silent for so long, but now the desperation was evident. Emily's voice broke as she left a message on Margaret's voicemail. "Mom, I don't know where to begin. I'm sorry. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and I can't take them back. Please, can we talk? I know I hurt you, and I just want to make things right. Please, just one chance to fix things." The messages from Mark were similar, laced with guilt and shame. But Margaret didn't respond immediately. She had learned her lesson. This wasn't going to be another round of manipulation. She wasn't going to fall back into the role of a dutiful mother who would give everything without receiving anything in return. Instead, Margaret took her time. And when she finally did respond, she made her conditions clear. When Margaret agreed to meet with Emily and Mark, it was on her terms. She had learned that true forgiveness couldn't be given lightly. She wouldn't simply take them back into her life without them understanding the depth of their wrongdoings, without them truly acknowledging the damage they had caused. The meeting took place in a small cafe, the same one where she had sat with Emily years ago, when everything still felt good and whole. Emily and Mark arrived, looking weary and disheveled, the weight of their actions clear on their faces. They had hoped to hear words of comfort, of understanding, but instead, they were about to hear the truth. "I'm willing to listen," Margaret began, her voice calm but firm, "but I need to make something clear first. You've hurt me deeply. You've taken from me without giving anything in return. For years, I've been the one sacrificing, and I've been taken for granted." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Mom. I was wrong. I should have never taken advantage of you. I've hurt you, and I can never undo it." Mark, his head bowed, spoke next. "I was selfish. I didn't see how much you were giving until it was too late. I'm sorry, Mom." Margaret nodded, but she wasn't done yet. "I will never again allow myself to be manipulated. You must respect my boundaries. No more loans, no more financial help. You need to rebuild your lives without me, just as I had to rebuild mine without you. And when I say no, you have to accept it." Emily and Mark agreed, their words tinged with regret and a newfound understanding. But Margaret could see the guilt in their eyes. They hadn't truly changed. They were only apologizing because they had lost everything. Margaret knew this wasn't just about the apology, it was about something deeper. The lesson of respect, responsibility, and morality was one she needed to teach them, not as a mother, but as a woman who would learn the hard way. "Let me make something clear," Margaret said, looking at them both with steady eyes. "You've taken more than money from me. You've taken my time, my energy, my love, and you've treated it like it didn't matter. Now you must learn to take responsibility for yourselves. Life doesn't always give us what we want, but we make do with what we have. And you must start living on your own terms without relying on others to make up for your failures." There was a long pause before Mark spoke, his voice quiet. "We understand. We will make things right, even if it takes years." Margaret nodded. A small sense of closure settled in. She had done what needed to be done. The lessons had been taught. As the conversation came to an end, Emily and Mark left the cafe quietly, their heads low. The journey of rebuilding their relationship would take time, and Margaret didn't know where that journey would end. But for the first time, she felt at peace. She had regained her dignity, and in doing so, she had ensured that her children would face the consequences of their actions. Margaret sat on her front porch as the late afternoon sun began to dip behind the trees. The soft rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed to echo the quiet peace she now felt. For so long, her life had been filled with tension, sacrifice, and the constant weight of unmet expectations. But now, after everything that had happened, she was finally free. Her house, once a place of quiet loneliness, had transformed into a sanctuary, a place where she could breathe deeply, relax, and enjoy the simple pleasures that had long been denied her. She spent her mornings tending to her garden, something she had always loved but never had the time to pursue. She found joy in the quiet moments, sipping coffee on the porch, watching the birds at the bird feeder, and listening to the sound of children playing in the distance. The shadows of betrayal that had once hung over her life had finally lifted, and as she reflected on how far she had come, Margaret couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. She had faced down the lies, the manipulation, and the exploitation, and she had emerged victorious. It wasn't just the peace and quiet she'd longed for, it was the freedom. Margaret was no longer a pawn in a game where others took what they wanted from her without giving anything in return. Her relationships with her friends and community had been completely transformed. She was now surrounded by people who truly valued her, people who respected her and saw her for who she truly was, not just as a provider, but as a person with her own needs, desires, and dreams. She spent more time with people who appreciated her. Her old friends from church and the neighborhood had come back into her life. They had all rallied to her side when they learned the truth, and now they made it a point to stay connected, to invite her to dinners, to go on walks, and to spend quality time together. It was different now. She wasn't just a giver, she was a valued part of their lives. Margaret had also taken up hobbies she had always put off. Painting, something she had always loved but never had the time to explore. She joined a local art class and was amazed by how much joy it brought her. For the first time in years, Margaret was living for herself. One evening, as Margaret sat with a glass of wine reflecting on the past few months, she thought deeply about what family truly meant. She had always believed that family was everything, that love and loyalty were the most important foundations of a relationship. But her experience had taught her something profoundly different. She had learned that not all family is truly family, and that love could sometimes be a one-way street. Her children had taken from her for years, draining her emotionally and financially without ever considering what it did to her. But now she saw clearly. Her true family wasn't defined by blood. It was the people who had stood by her, who had shown her care and respect when she needed it most. It was the friends who had supported her when her children had turned away, the community that had rallied to her side, and the people who had come back into her life when the truth came out. Real family wasn't about who shared her last name. It was about shared values, respect, and love. She had learned that the people who truly loved her were the ones who saw her worth, not those who used her for their own gain. As the days passed, Margaret found herself reflecting more and more on the lessons she had learned through the hardship and betrayal. It wasn't just about the money or the anger or the feelings of injustice. It was about respect, morality, and love. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about punishing those who wronged you. It was about standing up for what you deserve, about knowing your worth, and not allowing anyone to strip that from you. Respect was something that had been missing from her life for far too long. She had always given it, but had rarely received it in return. Now she was in a place where she demanded it. And she understood the importance of teaching others to respect their own boundaries and values. And love, true love, wasn't about sacrifice without boundaries or giving endlessly to others without expecting anything in return. True love was about mutual respect, understanding, and care. She had learned that self-love was just as important as the love she gave to others. Margaret looked at the sunset, her heart full of appreciation for the journey she had undertaken. She had been through the fire, but now she was stronger than ever. She had not only found justice, but she had found herself again. As Margaret sat there, enjoying the peace of her new life, she felt a desire to share her story. She knew that there were others out there who had faced similar struggles. People who had been betrayed, exploited, or made to feel invisible by their own families. She wanted to reach out to them, to offer encouragement and hope. If you're watching this, Margaret thought aloud, I want you to know that you're not alone. You deserve respect. You deserve love. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Stand up for yourself, just like I did. Your journey toward healing and justice starts the moment you decide that enough is enough. She smiled softly, thinking about the many others who had supported her. Share your story. Let the world know you're not going to stay silent anymore. Let's create a community of strength, a place where people can feel empowered to stand up for themselves, just like I did. Don't forget to subscribe, share your own experiences, and join me in the next chapter of this journey. Together, we can make sure that justice isn't just an ideal, it's a reality. Margaret felt a deep sense of peace as she finished her thought. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. The road ahead was bright, and with each new day she grew stronger, more confident, and more at peace with who she was and who she had become. Her story was far from over. It had only just begun. This was her new life, one of strength, independence, and the knowledge that true love and respect were possible, as long as she remained true to herself.